right, so thank you to our presenters. So let me give them a polite golf clap. All right. Okay, so what'd you guys think of this? How'd this go?
I was not prepared for this.
Okay.
I felt like I needed like a little parental guidance warning.
Hey, here's the thing. Like, I am in like I don't spring this on you day one, right? But I do make the assumption here that we are all adults and that we are all mature enough to handle this. And one thing I will say, just in general, when we talk about ancient world literature, right, sex and violence are all over it, as you've probably by now noticed. And in part, this was simply because, like, we live in a comparatively sanitized world, right? We sort of compartmentalize various parts of our lives and our identities, right? We are largely insulated from the violence that brings us the food we eat. Most of us are insulated from the violence of war. And, even, sex is something that is, not really shown on TV, and, it's something that you do away in private where no one else is watching, right? Whereas in the ancient world, your house probably only had 1 or 2 rooms. So, the kids are asleep on the kids are asleep in the next bed when you and the missus are getting intimate, right? So the basic functions of life were much closer to people's day-to-day reality than they are in the modern West, right? So that's one of the reasons why a lot of these texts take a much franker attitude towards violence and towards sexuality than we might be used to. And, another thing we have to remember about Greek drama specifically, where are its origins? What did it start out as?
They're entertainment plays.
Yeah, but the plays originated as something else. Before they started making plays out of them.
Oral retellings.
Right? Oral retellings, right? Performances of a chorus of a fertility ritual, right? All of this has its origins in fertility ritual, right? Almost all ancient world religions are fertility religions. So that's, when we look at old comedy, Greek old comedy in particular, right? It's much, much closer to those fertility ritual roots than, say, tragedy is by the time it's fully developed, right? It's hard to recognize the old fertility rituals in a play like Medea. It's much easier to do so in the comedies of Aristophanes. And that's in part because Greek comedy and Greek tragedy have very different concerns. Right? Tragedy involves the heroic, the relationship between human beings and the divine, and workings of fate. So large cosmic concerns with bigger than life characters. When we look at Greek comedy, on the other hand, particularly old comedy in the style of Aristophanes, and I'll explain in a moment what the distinction is between old comedy and new comedy, why we make a distinction. Comedy is by and large about the lives of ordinary people and is much more concerned directly than tragedy is with politics. Right. If we know enough about ancient Athens, we can see implicit political messages in a play like Medea, but it's not explicitly political. Right? Whereas if we look at the old comedy of Aristophanes, if we look at a play like Lysistrata, there are all sorts of references to the politics of Aristophanes' own day, right? There are all these names, for example, of people we don't recognize that we know nothing about, right? We don't know most of, well, okay, I know who these people are, but you probably don't, right? You don't know who Cleon is. You don't know who Cleisthenes is. You don't know who Lycon is, right? These guys were all prominent Athenian politicians, right? Cleisthenes appears mostly because he was noted for his effeminacy, right? He appears as a sort of joke figure. Lycon, apparently his wife had a reputation for promiscuity, so he's brought into the play again as a sort of joke. Cleon, on the other hand, was a demagogue who made it his mission to ramp up the people of Athens for a renewed push against Sparta during the truce, and he was noted for his brutality against Athenian colonies that tried to rise up against the mother city. So Cleon is treated a little bit more seriously here than other characters. But the point I'm trying to make in bringing this up, right, is that comedy was political and topical in a way that tragedy typically was not. Right. The struggles of the gods and heroes are sort of timeless and belong to the distant past. Any reference they have to the present is probably oblique. Comedy was supposed to be about stuff that's going on right now. So any other observations that you guys had about this play, or questions you had about it?
I kind of worry, I wish the book had included a different translation. There's a lot of modern dialogue and modern things in the play, and it kind of makes me wonder how much the translator messed with the meaning behind the play.
Yeah, well, and what the translator is trying to do is mimic the effects of sort of different Greek dialects that are used. For example, Aristophanes tries to make the Spartan characters, for example, sound noticeably different from the Athenian characters, right? They speak a different dialect, one that sounds kind of uneducated compared to the Athenians. And the reason why she chooses to use this kind of language, this level of language, is because Old Comedy was spoken not in the kind of high artificial idiom of tragedy, but in like the everyday language of normal people. So what she's going for is that particular effect. Now, if that means that particular words are not translated quite accurately, what she's going for is the same sort of spirit as the original.
There's also, I get that it's mostly supposed to be just an entertaining play that he probably wrote for some festival, but the whole premise of the play confuses me. This is a society that doesn't have the same hang-ups on same-sex relationships as we do.
No.
So, in fact, the whole male-female marriages were mostly business transactions anyway, weren't they?
By and large, this doesn't. And look, a couple of caveats I'm going to make about Greek attitudes towards sexuality. For most people, the sort of phase of their lives in which their relationships were primarily homosexual was in youth. Once you were married and settled into a family, then you were supposed to settle down, right? You were supposed to have gotten much of that out of your system. And your primary sexual outlet is indeed supposed to be your spouse. That doesn't mean that men can't go sleeping around and that they won't suffer for it, but by and large, right, this is stuff you're supposed to get out of your system when you're young. There are other things there are stereotypes here that Aristophanes is playing with as well, right? Who do we see here suffering more from lack of sex?
The women.
Really?
The men.
Yeah.
They're trying to stop the war.
Yeah, by the end of the play, like, these guys can barely walk, right? Like that's, they give in, because of the pressure, right? So one of the things he's doing is playing with that particular stereotype of men as calm and rational, right? That men don't think with their genitals, men think with their brains. And what Aristophanes is doing is like, no, actually, that's completely untrue, right? You deny a man sex for long enough, and he will buckle. So it's reversing that traditional stereotype and the traditional power dynamic. Another thing to note here is remember that tragedy and epic tend primarily to reflect elite belief and elite behavior. Right. In most societies, cultural elites are much more likely to try to theorize or rationalize their particular social behaviors. Ordinary people, by and large, don't do this sort of thing. And comedy, remember, is about everyday people. Everyday people in Athens would not be having lavish drinking parties with their friends, attended by prostitutes whom they can then fool around with, right? This was elite behavior. Comedy tends to reflect the salt of the earth, right? Normal people. And I think that, it is playing a lot with gender roles and with gender stereotypes and with the role of women publicly generally, right? We talked about in perhaps excruciating detail in other classes, right, this idea of the oikos. What's the oikos? Somebody remind me?
The home.
The home, yes.
One in our Siemens, I don't know what you call it.
Yeah, the woman is supposed to be the keeper of the home, right?
Yeah, that.
And the oikos is often opposed by classical scholars to the idea of the polis. The polis is the public sphere, right? The sphere of outside action, sphere of government, right? And the public sphere is supposed to be masculine space. But one of the things that this play does is confuse this conventional opposition a little bit, right? By showing that men actually do have important roles to play within the household, right? That the household is just as important to them. I mean, what happens, for example, when Marine's husband shows up at the Acropolis, right? Why does he need her apart from the fact that he's incredibly horny?
The baby.
Yeah, he has no idea what to do with the baby, right? He has no idea how to feed the baby. The house is falling apart, right? So he has an interest, certainly, in keeping the home and family maintained. Now, one thing that we get from the chorus of women we get, if we look on page, where the hell is it? I'll find it eventually. There's a page, and they talk about their ritual functions. All right, looks like I didn't make a note. At any rate, there is a point at which the women remind the men that, in fact, they don't just sit at home and do nothing. Right? Rather, they do have important ritual functions. This is part where they talk about funerals, for example. Funeral rites were largely performed by women in public. There were a number of religious rites performed in public where the primary roles belonged to women. So women had an important role not just in the oikos but also in the polis. And this is one of the things that the play is doing one of the things the play is trying to remind us of, right? That in fact, oikos and polis, instead of the polis simply being built on the well-organized oikos, in fact, these two things kind of interpenetrate each other. Right? The relationship is less the polis is greater than the oikos, and more the oikos and the polis have a sort of symbiotic thing going. Well, what else did you guys notice? Well, what else confused or interested you here? Yeah,
I
Darlene.
just had a question.
Yeah, sure.
When you were talking about like the translation and how it could be different, on page 833 it says, "So Aphrodite help us will stay put or not deserve the cherished title bitch." Did that mean something different back then?
No, actually, it's funny. If you look at the history of insults, they've remained markedly consistent across Western cultures over time.
Why would that be a cherished title?
For
Well-
the same reason some women call themselves bitches today.
Or like bad bitch, like that's
Yeah.
some people that cherish kind of
Sure, it's
we
like-
have today. So.
Yeah, you're a bit like you said, like I'm a badass, right?
Yeah.
It's taking a term that someone levels at you as an insult and reappropriating it and wearing it as a badge of honor, right? We see the same practice today, and yes, it does mean the same thing. What else you guys got? Yeah, Alexa.
I think what was shocking to me is how the women were speaking to the men.
Uh-huh.
I didn't think like, especially in their society, like women would speak to them the way that they were speaking to them, like cursing at them, and it was just shocking to me.
Yeah, and one thing to remember as we read the play, though, who's playing all the parts?
Men.
Yeah, all the parts are still played by men.
Yeah.
So even these female characters, right, they may be saying things that actual women may not be able to say. But yeah, that's actually one of the things that's funny about the bit where they dress up the counselor in women's clothes, right? Is you're taking, a bunch of men dressed as women are taking a man dressed as a man and dressing him up as a woman too. So yeah, hysterical, yeah, right. But yeah, where was I going with that? I think we also tend to, and this play actually sort of helps to point that out to us, that we tend to overemphasize in a lot of ways the lack of power, the lack of authority that Greek women had over their own lives.
Compared to other cultures, weren't they like, they had a lot of rights? I mean, some of the ancient cultures, they had like nothing. But here
Well,
they-
it differed from city-state to city-state. Spartan women actually typically had more rights than Athenian women did. And that was in part because the men were always away fighting wars, so someone had to stay home and basically manage property, right? But again, remember too that like for the average person, the division between oikos and polis doesn't matter as much as it does for the aristocrat. The average person probably isn't participating all that much in the great political deliberations of the day anyway, right? You're too busy getting your crop in, right? Or trying to sell the pottery you made, or what have you.
But didn't they still have direct vote? I mean, they had to at least have time to like.
Yeah. Oh, they did, and craftsmen actually did, in fact.
Right.
There's records of craftsmen voting and holding public positions. But usually when you see people when you read histories of ancient Greece, you look at people who are associated with particularly very conservative, traditionalist, or warlike political programs, they come from the aristocratic class. By and large, the people who don't have to work. And those were typically the people who had the most influence. All right, so by and large, gender roles in ancient Greece are dependent on, or they're at least initially decided by division of labor, really. That's what they originally come down to. Right? So women are responsible for certain kinds of work, men are responsible for certain other kinds of work. Right? Women, for example, are responsible for childcare. Right? We see, poor Synesius has no friggin' idea how to take care of his kid. Women were responsible for spinning and weaving, essentially making clothes. Cooking. Gathering water. And, right, keeping the hearth, keeping the home. Men were responsible for agriculture, politics, war, and any kind of external social activity. So for most Greeks, that's really as far as it gets, is that division of labor, right? You do this stuff, I do that stuff. It's really only when we're talking about the aristocracy that it gets into ideas of superiority and inferiority. Yeah, Kayla?
I get the gender division, but why did it go as far as dividing them in age too? Because you have the women, the men, the older women, and the older men.
Yeah,
what's the deal with that?
That's actually a really good catch. Yeah, why are the old men the ones who are trying to root the women out of the Acropolis?
Tradition. They're elders.
Well, yeah, they're elders. They're also they're associated with tradition. But what more practical reason?
Because the younger men are off fighting.
The younger men are off at war. Yeah, the old men are left to defend the city. Right. So yes, they do represent tradition, but they're also there because the young men are gone. Do the old women behave differently from the young women? If we look for pardon?
More aggressive about things.
More progressive?
Aggressive.
Aggressive, okay. Certainly so, yeah. And do the old women seem to waver at all in the cause?
Not until the very end where it turns to the reconciliation part.
Yeah, and that's a conventional part of old comedy that I'll explain in a moment. That's something that's supposed to happen in an old comedy. The two choruses come together near the end. But yeah, the old women don't really mind taking this oath, don't mind fighting this fight, don't waver from the cause, and are always reminding the chorus of old men of all the good they've done for Athens in the course of their lives, right? So the old women are more steadfast than the young women are. Right, the young women are trying to sneak off to be with their husbands. Lysistrata has a difficult time getting the young women to swear the oath in the first place, right? It's like, what? You want us to do what?
Oh, yeah.
Right, so the young women conform a lot more to that conventional Greek female stereotype, right? Oversexed and hysterical. With the exception of Lysistrata herself. But yeah, the old women don't conform to that stereotype.
I mean, their hormones are fine.
Yeah, well, I don't think they really knew too much about the workings of menopause, but yeah. Yeah, certainly there's the idea that the blood has cooled, perhaps, by that time, right? But yeah, the young women are presented in that conventional, hystericalized way. The old women aren't. Yeah, that's actually a really good catch. Now, the device of the split chorus itself is common in old comedy. They all work this way. Right. A tragedy had a unified chorus of 12 men that represented some public body, right? Whether it's the women of Corinth, or the elders of Thebes, or what have you, right? They speak as one. Comedy gives us a split chorus to present from the beginning a conflict that needs to be resolved. Right, so when the chorus first appears, that ode is called the parados, which is also a word for door, right? The entrance of the chorus. The split chorus arrives and sort of set the terms of their conflict. So in this play, this would be when the old men are trying to smoke out the women, right? They show up with the logs, they try to light the fire, and smoke the women out of the Acropolis. And the women fight back with water.
How many, like you said for the tragedy, there's 12 men and then unified. For the comedy, would there be the same number and just divided, or would it be like
24.
12? Oh, okay, so it's
Yep.
12 and
24, 12 and 12, yep. The remainder of the choral odes are taken up first by what's called agon, or conflict. And this is actually the reason why the chorus is split, right? They each take opposing sides in a debate. And for the remainder of their appearances but one, after the parados, right, they go back and forth over this conflict. Sometimes characters in the play will get involved in the agon as well. And the final choral ode is called the parabasis. And the parabasis is the point at which the two choruses come back together and address the audience directly. And this usually announces the end of the conflict, right? We've resolved our differences. And we're coming back together. All right, so that's how the chorus operates in an old comedy. Now, in most old comedy plays, again, in keeping with the role of, or the origins of the genre in fertility ritual, most of the actors, at least the actors playing male parts, particularly in the chorus, would also be wearing fake phalluses, which would be especially sort of ridiculous and comical on the old men. All right. Any other questions, comments, observations? What else you got? Yeah, Kayla.
Okay, so you said they addressed the audience,
Mm-hmm.
and is that why they broke the fourth wall?
Yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly what happens in the parabasis. They break the fourth wall.
Okay.
They stop talking to each other and start talking directly to you. So like, I guess that you've got something located there. Mm-hmm. Could you read the passage you're looking at? Tell us what it is.
It's on 856, and
Okay.
the Spartan ambassador says, "And us to Pal, maybe the audience could see that we was playing with ourselves."
Mm-hmm.
He was acknowledging that there's an audience.
Yes, yes. The parabasis has actually come slightly earlier, sort of where the male chorus and the female chorus rejoin each other. Mm-hmm. But yeah, from that point, it becomes safe and normal for the characters to address the audience directly. All right. What else you got? Yeah, go ahead.
I kind of have a question.
Mhm.
So like, whenever, we finally get to like a midterm and we're looking at these terms, are those like the type of things that we should be like keeping up with, or are those more like to give us the whole picture?
Now, these are things you should, particularly things that recur from class to class. Those are the things that are most likely to show up on the test. But yeah, these are things you should certainly be keeping track of, yes. If I throw out a term and spend more than a few minutes on it, then yes, I want you to remember it. Okay, so maybe we talk a little bit about the distinction between old comedy and new comedy, like what makes this an old comedy, what that term means. So the original Greek comedies, as far as we can tell, seem to have been mostly like disconnected skits joined by choral odes, right, with no unified plot. Basically sort of episodes of clowning in between bits of a chorus singing and dancing.
So that's original comedy.
That would be, yeah, at least the rituals that comedy grows out of. We have the names of about 40 known poets, but the only one whose plays survive at all is Aristophanes. So, anything that we say about general features of old comedy has to be taken with a little bit of a grain of salt, because we only know it from what we have of ancient commentators and what we have of Aristophanes' plays. So I'm just warning everybody that we're generalizing from a very small sample. We know about other playwrights, but we don't have any of their works. So this is what we think, by and large, old comedy looked like, right? We've already gone over some of this a little bit, right? It tended to be political and topical, very much about current events. Right. Current events for the ancient Greeks, not for us. It tended to be bawdy and obscene, lots of sex jokes, lots of scatological jokes.
What jokes?
Scatological, jokes about shitting and pissing.
Gotcha.
Oh, there's a name for that?
Yeah, yeah. Scatological has to do with yeah. If you see the word scatological, that means it has to do with body functions. So this is a very earthy, very physical form of comedy that is also marked by a lot of slapstick humor, a lot of physical comedy. Tumbling, punching, falling down, right? Three Stooges kind of crap. Now, we call this old comedy because this particular form does not survive very long after the fall of the Athenian democracy. Lasts maybe about a generation after the fall of Athenian democracy. It's replaced by what comes to be called new comedy. Creatively, yes. And the only Greek source we have for new comedy is the plays of a playwright called Menander. Although we also have several Roman plays that are based on Greek models. So when we look at what new comedy is supposed to be like, we have also very little to go on.
Is there any way we could get like a circa for the new comedy?
I'd say, yeah, old comedy, we're talking more or less 5th to early 4th century BCE. And new comedy, we're looking at mostly late 4th century BCE. New comedy actually gets spread much more widely around Alexander the Great's empire. Right, so to a person in, say, for the 4th or 3rd century BCE, if they thought about Greek comedy, new comedy is probably what they would think of, right? This is why the Roman plays are based on these models and not on the older models. Also because these were less culturally specific, right? New comedy, from what we can tell, was very closely related to what we call romantic comedy. And the typical plot formula seems to have been a young couple whose union is somehow disrupted by an older, interfering person. So two young people who want to get together, but some old person is in the way. That's new comedy, right? Much less culturally specific, much easier to translate culturally than old comedy would have been, right? Old comedy, to make sense, really required that specific Athenian context. Although we can see, if we look at the reception history of a play like Lysistrata, that indeed many of the themes in the play about gender relations, about war, about politics, actually do translate very well across cultures and across generations. Right? There are people still doing revivals of Lysistrata. I think I heard you saying, Alexa, that Jeff Green wants to do this play. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, they made a movie not too long ago called Chirac that used Lysistrata.
Yeah, it was a Spike Lee movie, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I'd heard about it. Right. Lysistrata is the basic plot.
It's going up a lot that I remember, but the Chirac thing is the only specific thing one I remember.
Yeah.
What is that word right there?
What
For
word?
young couple?
Young couple versus older interfering person.
Interfering, okay. And
Yes.
what about plays of what?
Menander. Menander.
Love your handwriting.
Yeah, I apologize for my terrible handwriting.
No, it's
Just
like all
because-
the professor's handwriting is not a big deal.
Well, we yeah, I can't speak for anyone else. Sometimes I think our brains work faster than our hands do, but
It's always been my excuse.
hmm?
Always been my excuse.
Yeah. It's a good one.
Would it necessarily have to be a physical person interfering, or couldn't it just be like old cultural ideas interfering, for instance?
It's usually a person.
Okay, it's like a physical presence.
These plots are very formulaic. They have stock characters, right? They give these stock characters different names, but the names are usually allegorical in some way. Like the name will mean something like young hero, or old asshole, or sort of things of that nature, right?
Like how a lot of them have similarity to Apollo. Like it seems like a lot of them are like derivatives almost.
Not sure. Give me an example.
Well, I haven't seen it on these, but like you see like, I can't even remember the name, it's like
20 characters, but it like starts off APP something. I don't know. I can't think of the name right now.
Okay. Yeah. I think.
Yeah.
I can't speak to that. I don't really know, but one last thing I want to say about comedy generally, and the way comedy tends to work. There's a guy he's a literary critic. His name is Northrop Frye. He wrote mostly in the 1950s, and a lot of his work is a little bit out of date. It's been superseded by other things. But much of what he had to say about literary genres and the way literary genres operate is still pretty useful. So this is how he broke down comedy, right? What he argued comedy looked like. So in a comedy, you start with an imperfect but stable status quo, right? Your social world at the beginning of a comedy is in some way flawed, but it is at least stable, right? Most people in the play seem to accept the basic terms of that social world. Then something happens to throw that social world out of balance. Somebody announces a sex strike, for example, and makes all of her neighbors swear on a bowl of wine that they will abide by it. Right? Women invade the treasury and refuse to let the men in. Right? A disruption to the normal way of doing things. And all of this then tends towards, as a reconciliation as plot resolution. And the establishment of a better social order, right? This is why, for example, if we look at, how many of you ever had to read, like, say, any of Shakespeare's comedies in high school? Okay, that's right, a lot of you, right? Why do so many of them end in marriage? What's the point of the marriage at the end of a Shakespeare comedy? What's it usually doing?
So marriages are like new beginnings and new lives and stuff.
Yeah, new beginnings, new lives, and they're bringing forces that were formerly in conflict into a new arrangement, right? Usually, the marriage has been blocked by some force that needs to be dealt with, or the two, the members of the couple, hated each other from families that hated each other, or something like that, right? And they have to be brought together at the end for a new, more perfect order, right? So whatever flaw there was at the beginning of the play is exorcised by the end of it. Now, tragedy does similar things, right? But tragedy tends to resolve its issues by pushing out the difficult person.
Like Romeo and Juliet. Well, they
Yeah.
die, so they're pushed out.
Yeah, Romeo and Juliet, right? The social order is changed by getting rid of the troublesome people.
Nice way of conflict resolution.
Yeah. In comedy, the plot is resolved by bringing together opposing factions and getting them to make a new agreement. Much in the way sort of this play works, right? We already talked about what that imperfect but stable status quo was. The social world thrown out of balance, and then they agree to end the strike when Athens and Sparta agree to make peace, right? And that's it, you got your comedy. Woohoo. All right, we're running close to time. Does anybody have any other questions? There's a lot more we could say about this. Any other questions, comments? Yeah, Alexa.
In on page 825.
Yeah.
It has the list of characters. I see that the chorus of old women as 2 slaves. Why are the old women they're slaves?
Oh, they're not. Those are different lists.
Oh, different lists.
Yeah, these two lists are not actually related to each other.
Oh, okay, cool.
I mean, excepting that they are all characters. The second list does not. They're separate characters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I was like, what?
Yeah. No. The two slaves are not the coercive old women.
So this Greek society had slaves.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And they were not really very picky about where they drew their slaves from. Native Greeks could be made into slaves as well, often through being indebted to someone. We saw actually slaves in Medea, right? The nurse and the tutor and the messenger would all have been slaves. Those were the kinds of work that were typically done by slaves, in addition to regular old manual labor. But the Greeks and the Romans, and frankly most ancient societies, practiced some form of slavery.
Would this be the type of thing that would have been performed in the amphitheater, or is this still a stage?
No, all of these plays would have been performed outdoors in a public amphitheater. In fact, let me just quickly, before everybody packs up and is ready to go, I'll draw you a picture for those of you who might not be familiar, what a Greek amphitheater would have looked like. And because you know what my artwork looks like, this will be of questionable value, but okay, so you've got a round pit with an altar at the front, a permanent backdrop with doors in it in the back. Usually a crane off to the side someplace to lift up, say, gods and heroes who are ascending into heaven or who need to be lowered to the stage. And stone benches all around. The Theater of Dionysus in Athens could seat about 10,000 people. The sheer size of the theater is evidence for us that these plays were a big event that were attended by just about, Athens as a city itself, was big for a city at that time, but is tiny by our standards. So 10,000 people would have been a hell of a lot of people. It's, about over half the population of Americas, if that helps you. All right, so I have some guide questions for you. For next time, you're going to be looking at Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Oh man, I can't tell the amphitheater.
Come back here. And we'll see you on Wednesday. Those of you who are in the presentation group, Thursday, yes, this is a Tuesday, Thursday class, thank you. Those of you who are in the presentation group, if you could give me